But thank you everybody for coming. I would love to have traveled to New Zealand. It's one of the places on the list that I've always wanted to be, but this summer was not a good summer to travel there. So hopefully in a future time. But I wanted to talk to you all about SAMM version 2 and the SAMM benchmark. But I also, as per requested, thank you for all the sponsors and the hosts, so that way we can hold a conference. So we can get together, share information, and just generally take a break for a couple of days. So who am I? So I'm Brian Glas, married father of 4. Currently, my primary job is an assistant professor of computer science and cybersecurity. I've been doing this too long, I feel sometimes, but it's been over 21 years. And outside of teaching classes and consulting, I spend a good bit of time contributing to the OWASP SAMM and the SAMM Benchmark. And I'm also one of the co-leads for the OWASP Top 10, started in 2017 and also in the 2021 version. So what is SAMM? So SAMM stands for the Software Assurance Maturity Model. It's an open framework, one of the very few for doing secure development practices. And the idea is it's there to help organizations measure and implement strategy for software security. So the goal is that SAMM can help you evaluate your existing practices, where you're at, help you to build a balanced software security assurance program. One of the things we try to do is not necessarily simplify things, but try to manage the complexity in the model so that things are easier to grasp and easier to figure out iterations. The other thing we try to do within the SAMM is being able to give you a way to measure concrete improvements. The goal is to be able to show somehow in a measurable way that you're making improvement. Move the graph up to the right, the normal things that we're taught are good. The upper right quadrant is good. Thanks, Gartner, for that. And then trying to define and measure different security-related activities. So if you look at the team that works on SAMM, it's actually quite a globally diverse team. There's names in there I would expect you to recognize, like John DeLeo. But the co-leaders are in Belgium. We've got folks in Germany, Uruguay, Sweden, the US, Argentina, the UK. So we have a lot of different perspectives that get brought to the project. And it's needed because SAMM is a model that we've tried to build for all the way from a smaller organization up into a very large enterprise global organization. And that's an interesting challenge to take on. So why look at SAMM? So I like this quote from George Box. So George Box was a British statistician, and he worked a lot with different models and such. And he said the most that can be expected from any model is that it can supply a useful approximation to reality. And this is the part that I like most. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And the goal with SAMM is we understand we're not going to fit every organization to a T. It's basically impossible to do so. But the hope is that SAMM is actually useful. So in the core principles of SAMM, and we've carried these since the beginning of SAMM, and it's understanding that organizations' behavior changes slowly over time. You're not going to make earth-shattering changes in a very short period of time. Each organization changes differently because a large part of what drives security in an organization is cultural. And so changing the culture of an organization provides the longest lasting effect, but is also some of the more difficult things to do. So SAMM understands that you can't just check a couple boxes and you're good to go and you now have secure development solved. And related to that is there's no single recipe that works for all organizations. If we did, then I could just build you a single silver bullet, like do this and you have secure software, and then I would be done and we would have other things to move on to do. But if you've played with software development and software security, you know that there's a ridiculous amount of complexity out there. So basically what we have to look at is like, how do we enable a way for organizations to make risk-based decisions? And they need to be tailored for the organization because, again, your culture comes in and your IT maturity and your tech stack and all of these different things feed into what you do as a priority for your organization. We also believe that within a model that the guidance related to security activities needs to be prescriptive. Most people come to SAMM looking for guidance. Like one, they want to know where they're at. They want to know what they're doing right, but they also need to know what's next. What order do I need to do things in that makes sense? What are some suggestions based on where I'm at? And so the overall goal of SAMM is to be as simple as we can make it so that it's easily consumable and usable, but also well-defined and measurable. So some of the history of SAMM. So you may have heard of OpenSAMM. So OpenSAMM was driven by, at the time, Fortify, if I remember right, and Pravir Chandra. And you've probably also heard of BSIMM. I could put it in this diagram. BSIMM would actually fork off of a little before OpenSAMM over on the left side over here. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but the similarities between BSIMM and SAMM were because they originated from the same draft model at the beginning of all of this. So OpenSAMM 1 was published in 2009. And it pretty much, I mean, it was well thought out, well done, but it pretty much sat there for a number of years. And then a OWASP project got together to try and revamp SAMM. And the OpenSAMM name and Pravir wanted to keep that for some potential future stuff. So essentially OWASP SAMM that we now work on maintaining and upgrading, it's technically a fork of OpenSAMM. And in 2016, we released OpenSAMM 1.1. And then we went to OpenSAMM 1.5. And I'll talk a little bit about the changes. There were some major changes in 1.5 that were really important. And then I'll talk a little bit about how SAMM 2 got to be and where we're going with that in Benchmark. But if you look up OpenSAMM, you will find a website that was basically from 2009. And you might get a little confused at it. So if you look up OWASP SAMM, and I'll give you some links at the end as well, you'll find the version of SAMM that's openly or actively being maintained and improved upon. So one of the big things that we did in SAMM 1.5 is we had to update how the scoring worked for doing assessments against the model. So in SAMM 1.0 and 1.1, you would have assessment questions. And these questions would essentially ask you, are you, for example, like in education and guidance, we would say, do you have role-based training? So something specific for testers or developers or project managers, things like that. And the answer was essentially yes, no. And so we realized that people would run into a problem, and that is if you had done some role-based training, say for instance, you had role-based training that was for your developers, but not for the other primary roles in your software development, you ended up with a problem. So if you answered no, then you didn't get any credit for work that you had actually done. If you answered yes, then it's very hard to actually get justification and budget for doing something that you had actually answered yes to. And so it was essentially an absolute. You either did it completely or not at all. And if you've worked in this space for any length of time, you know that neither of those are actually common. Usually there's a little bit of something somewhere. No can happen, but generally the all is quite rare. So we had to change that. So in 1.5, we actually went to a scale where we said, all right, you can have 4 different answers and it will give you different incrementing scores. And so if you answered a question and said no, then you would have a 0. Few or some would net you a 0.2, at least half is 0.5, and many or most is 1. And it's not quite a straight linear scale because as you know, if you've dealt with this, it's easier to get started with a few. It's the broader the program or the broader coverage you try to get for a particular security activity, you know, the harder it is to continue down that road and to get more and more or groups and applications under the wing or within that activity. So your score improves more and more the better coverage that you have. So that way also, as you get started, if you look at SAMM through different phases, your score can continue to improve. You don't just get an improvement in score when you start an activity, but you get it as the activity grows and matures. And then we also have the maturity levels. And so the maturity levels in general are from 0 to 3. And before SAMM 1.5, you would only get credit if you completely did all of the activities of one particular maturity level. So if you did all the activities for maturity level 2 and 3, but we're missing a couple of them at maturity level 1, then you would end up with like a 0+ because you hadn't completed the base level of activities. And we found that over time, depending on the different organizations, that people did not follow the model in a linear progression. And so as technologies changed, as development methodologies changed, organizations would do different activities in different orders. And so starting in 1.5 and continuing in 2.0, you can have activities completed. You could have answers for some, at least half, at different levels, different activities, or at different maturity levels, and you get credit for all of them. Because we wanted to make sure that if you were doing the work to improve the security of your software, that you get credit for it, because that's important. Because if somebody invests the money, gives you the budget, and you get work done, you expend those person hours, then you should have credit. If you're going to get measured, you need to be able to improve that score. So the 1.5 framework started, and it had 4 primary business functions. So you had governance, construction, verification, and operation. And this was also built, so remember, this was also built, started working on probably 2006, 2007, released 2009. The predominant software development methodology was still largely waterfall. And as that changed and grew over the years, we started to realize in 2.0, as we were trying to figure out what we were going to do to update the model, is we were actually missing something. And so the model was a couple of things. One, this was more than just pure software development. Construction and verification were really the only things that are in a traditional SDL. Most software development lifecycles do not include governance, and most of them don't really include operations. You might have at the end of your little SDL, you might have a support box, the little one that hides in the corner. That is really the majority of the life cycle of your application, but hey, we give it a little spot in the corner. So we realized that SAMM is much larger scale than a pure SDL, and we are also missing something. So in SAMM 2, we decided to break the model in a good way. So we decided that we needed implementation. So in SAMM 1.5, we had construction, but it really wasn't as much construction as it was design. because you have security requirements, you have architecture, you have threat assessments or threat modeling, and then you just coded. So somewhere in between construction and verification, you wrote code. So you designed things in construction, and then you tested them in verification. Well, the current software methodology structures started adding a whole lot more in between the two. So now you have build and these much more complicated build environments. You have deployment environments. We realized we didn't have a whole lot around defect management. So now we have 5 business functions. We actually renamed construction to design, and we added implementation. So the difference between 1.5 and 2.0 are primarily in these areas that are highlighted by the red boxes. So we updated operations a little bit more to be able to take into account some of the more modern changes that were being done. And then, like I said, largely added a bunch into implementation. So if you expand the model out a little bit, one thing you'll notice, and this is the question we get frequently, is, wow, SAMM is really symmetrical. That seems weird. And it's a conscious decision. So SAMM is symmetrical to balance the scoring. So that means that there may be some things that some organizations do that may not be in here, and there may be some things in here that are covered a little deeper than you might expect them to cover. And that's a conscious choice within the model to keep the model balanced. It's something we discuss regularly, whether someday we will break the balance. Another thing that's brought up often is weighting. So some of these activities and different streams under the practices may carry more weight or have more importance. But at this point, within a core team, we believe that that importance can change, or that weight may change depending on your risk profile as an organization. So it's not something we build into the model at this point that is a standard setup for somebody. It's something we're thinking about and something we're considering, especially related to benchmark. But at the moment, we have a very balanced model so that things are scored evenly. It makes that a little bit easier and smoother in terms of being able to measure things within the model. So you notice that there are 2 streams for every security practice. So you have 5 business functions, and under each business function, you have 3 security practices, and under each practice, you have these streams. And within these streams, you have different security activities. So one of the things we did in SAMM 2 as well is we built the streams to be more of a maturing progression. So the elements within the streams are more related to each other. And so trying to understand that as organizations grow and mature, that they will continue, that there is a natural progression for some of these activities. So one of the things you can do, so within SAMM, one of the primary ways that people will run assessments is we have what we call the toolbox, which is a really cool name for an Excel spreadsheet, because the #1 security tool is Excel, right? So there's a lot of things you can do in Excel, but basically it gives you a good starting point. So we have a lot of people that they need to send out questionnaires, or they distribute them, or they don't want a centralized system for it. They want to be able to do it this way in terms of being able to hand out different files or carry them with them to sessions. So within the toolbox itself, you can see that we have the main business function, and then within the business function, you have the different practice areas, and then the practice areas, you have different activities. So we have build process and software dependencies, and you have different questions within those. And so you can ask, hey, is your build process fully automated? Do you enforce automated security checks in your build process? And then we also have guidance. So trying to help you understand what the question is asking. So what kind of criteria help you answer that question. So in SAMM's setup that you can self-assess, or you can get a third party to do an assessment for you. And having done a little of both, mostly third party, not as much in self-assessing, one of the ways that I found is most useful to conduct SAMM assessments is to have somebody study the model, understand what the questions are, and then go interview roles and people who are responsible for doing the work. But hold a conversation. Just ask them how their processes are, how does this work, how does it not work, what's working well, and be able to derive the answers from those interview sessions. Because a couple of things. One, you're going to end up with more accurate answers. Humans are not the best at sharing information in forms. We're designed to share via stories and drawing pictures. So giving somebody a Excel form is not generally the best way to collect information. It just won't be as complete or as accurate. The other benefit to doing the interview sessions is you get a lot of additional information that helps you understand the context, so that when you're looking at trying to figure out what to recommend going forward for improvements, you understand the context of why these answers are no, yes for some, yes at least half, that kind of thing. So SAMM also has, and we're working on them, there's a couple of applications. There's the SAMWise application that we're working on using, that's a team's working on to help people be able to use an app to collect the data. And there's also SAMMy, which is another application that somebody's been working on to also try and collect data that way. Within the spreadsheet, we also have dashboards. So we try and give you a way to represent what your score is and where the different scores come from. So you can see, for instance, in this example, under education and guidance, the majority of the score is coming from activities that are related, that are typically expected to be part of a maturity level 3. So this is what I mean when I say some organizations don't follow a linear path. And sometimes, depending on what the organization does for IT or different leaders they've had with different experiences, a lot of times you will end up with more of the score coming from things that we would have expected to be later, or have other things done before it as a maturity. So like requirements testing here, this is a more typical example where more of the weight is in maturity level 1 and it tapers off as you go to higher maturity levels. But it's not always that way. And then we also have your aggregate scores for each of the different business function areas so that you can see how well you're doing for a particular business function. So we also have a bit of a roadmap. So within the Excel spreadsheet to run things, we have a roadmap where you can answer questions, or you have different phases, and they're not really time bound because we know different organizations have different time cycles. But we have the ability for you to say, hey, if I do these particular activities, I will change the answer to this question, either improving or regressing. And then you would get a predicted score. So we'd say, I would anticipate your score goes up at a certain level by answering these different questions based on completing these activities. So critical success factors for SAMM is like with any, it sounds kind of redundant to me to having played with this for a while, but you need buy-in from stakeholders. If they're not going to participate, then it's going to be really hard to do. Security is a very collaborative effort. It can't be forced on people. It can't be top down purely without, I mean, it can, it just doesn't work really well. It needs to have collaboration. It needs to have buy-in from people who have to do the work. Awareness and education is realistically the foundation, because a lot of having security integrated in your development lifecycle is mindset. It is realizing I need to think about risks when I do this. Integrate and automate as much as you can. Development is only moving faster, for better or worse. And so we need to be able to keep up with it from a security perspective. And one of the things SAMM can really help with is be able to provide management visibility through a scoring system by giving you that ability to measure it. And so we've had a number of folks come with SAMM and they say, hey, we really like how this works. We can show improvement over time and over cycles as we see scores improve because we can change the answers to the different questions. So a question I get a lot as well is, can SAMM map to BSIMM? And the answer is sort of. So SAMM, notice the commonality here. So we have strategy and metrics in SAMM and strategy and metrics in BSIMM. And then we have policy and compliance. And look at that, we have compliance and policy. Education and guidance versus training. At a really high level, SAMM 1.5 essentially had the same categories, same security practices as BSIMM. If you dug into the details, they start diverging in terms of what questions are asked in BSIMM and what kinds of things they attempt to measure. The details at the low level have been diverging for a while. And so when we went to SAMM 2, there's actually now 5. So this is a SAMM 1.5 spider diagram. But SAMM 2 now has 5 business functions. So it's even a little bit further out of alignment with BSIMM. If you want to know more of the details of it, we have a blog post on the opensamm.org site where we actually compare the difference between SAMM and BSIMM. For the most part, I mean, we're kind of biased, but we feel that SAMM fits a lot of organizations really well, but there is a compelling case for BSIMM in certain scenarios. So if we don't compare terribly well to BSIMM anymore, at least not just straight up easily, how do we measure things? And that's where SAMM Benchmark comes into play. So SAMM Benchmark comes out because one of the first questions that we get from organizations is, how do I compare? Right? So I have a score. I know I have competitors. I have other people that have organizations in the same industry vertical, might be similar size, might be similar geographic areas. How do I compare? Am I way behind the competition? Am I way ahead? You know, how can I use that information to be able to say, hey, I need more budget because we are seriously trailing behind competitors or other people in the field, even if we don't directly compete with them. So SAMM Benchmark is a project that is coming out from basically a lot of requests to be able to have a data set where people can try and determine where they're at. Some organizations would try and compare themselves to BSIMM. The problem with doing that they ran into is BSIMM is really, it's tough to say it's a representative sample of software security programs. And part of that is, for instance, the average software security group in the organizations that BSIMM has run assessments on is more than 20 people, which to me is phenomenally large. But that's partially because I ran the AppSec team at FedEx for a number of years, and we had 6. We had 6 people for all the developers at FedEx, project managers, applications, everything. I don't know what I would have done with over 20 people, but that's a really large group to me. that are all dedicated for software security. So it's really more of a much larger organizations. So that makes it much tougher for small to medium organizations to be able to measure themselves against that. So within Benchmark, we also realized that the model's a little different than BSIMM. So BSIMM has a single organization that does the assessments, and that's the only way you can do it. So SAMM allows for both self-assessing and for a consultancy to actually do a third-party assessment. And so we're looking at collecting data from both. Now, one of the things we're planning to do as well is we intend to mark that data essentially so that when you want to compare yourself, you can choose to only compare yourself against third-party assessments if you choose to. Or you can say, hey, I want the whole data set that's both self-assessed or third-party. And part of the thought behind that is the general understanding that a third-party assessment is more likely to be accurate or more accurate. They don't have a potential for a bias. So if you're self-assessing, and I've seen it a number of times, some people tend to be a little easier on themselves and gives themselves a little bit higher score. Whereas third-party consultants are typically more likely to be accurate on the assessment of how they're scoring answers to questions for organizations. Granted, that's general, not always. There's some thoughts that self-assessors may be more accurate because they understand their stuff better. It depends. If you have somebody who is well-versed in SAMM, it's entirely possible. But I don't think it's really the norm from my experience. So one of the big challenges to solve for SAMM Benchmark is, where do we put it? How are we neutral? How can we be trusted with the data? So we're going to use, right now the plan is to use the Azure cloud infrastructure. Minimal number of administrators have access to the raw data, and the goal is to have dashboards and a comparative analysis so that organizations can submit their data, but they're separated from it. So you know that there's data in there from an organization, and it may be a global organization that's in technology industry vertical with a certain number of people in it and such, and these are their scores. The idea is we understand it's sensitive for organizations to have their data in a central pool. And so the idea is trying to separate the identification of the organization with their actual data. Because we want to be able to let organizations do internal comparisons or be able to measure trend data, and then be able to compare themselves over time. But what we also want to be able to do is be able to publish more population level, be able to understand the state of software security within different regions or globally, depending on different size companies and stuff like that. So be able to do that for organizations. So looking at data contributions, so there's different scenarios that we're working with. Some that the submitter is known as agreed to be identified. This only means that your company would say, hey, we contribute to SAMM Benchmark, not that that company's name is associated with a particular score. The second scenario is the one I expect to be more common is the team knows who submitted, but they're not publicly identified on a website that says, hey, I contributed to X. BSIMM even has this. Only a percentage of the organizations that go through BSIMM assessments in the data set that's published in aggregate actually identify that they're part of that data set. The third scenario is actually where an organization says, I will contribute my data, but I really, really don't want my name associated with it in the data set itself. So that presents some interesting challenges because generally, one, we need to vet to make sure that the data is reasonable and accurate, because one of the primary things we need is a good, solid, accurate data set. But we also need to be able to allow you to go back and update it. So being able to do that, but not necessarily have it tied to an organization that somebody could determine, is an interesting challenge. And in theory, we've considered whether or not we would allow anonymous contributions. Right now, we're leaning toward no, just because it's really, really hard to validate how accurate that data is if the contribution is actually anonymous. So right now, if you're like, hey, I want to contribute and I want to get started now, you can send it to me. If you want, I promise I'll take care of it. But what we're doing right now is working on building the initial data set, and I'm working on a project to essentially build the database in an API and a base site to be able to pull reports out of so that you can do comparisons. But that there'll be a workflow to be able to contribute to the site. That will be a review base, and then the data will be extracted and transformed into the aggregate, and then be able to load it up into the benchmark tool. So the idea is in the future that you'll be able to upload it from the Excel toolbox, upload it from Samwise or SAMMY, be able to send it through an API call, things like that. So that's in active design, soon to be active development, and we're hoping to have something by the end of the year that is actually up and running. So just a real quick high level of the data structure, we're looking at trying to have a contributor name and email so we can reach out if we need to. But we're looking at having that designed as part of the workflow to be actually into a bit of a separate thing. Date of assessment is important. Type of assessment is also important. Answers to questions, version of SAMM that you used. Language, geographic, industry. So we're trying to look at different types of metadata that would be useful for being able to compare yourself to, without being so specific that if you looked at the metadata, you could be, oh, like I know what that company is. So that's why we're looking at this different type of data elements. So, and especially looking at like ranges, right? So like number of developers, just a factor of 10. In terms of being able to figure out like what ranges make sense. Because I don't really need to know if you have 532 developers. Tomorrow it might be 535 or 530. That's kind of irrelevant. I just need to know generally what size you are within a range. So I also wanted to give you one other quick example of how we've used SAMM within different organizations. So in the US, we're looking at a pilot program. So it's called RABET-V. It's called a Rapid Architecture-Based Election Technology Verification. Really long name, but the whole idea is for non-voting technology. And so this is basically all the supporting technology for electronic voting that's not part of the actual voting process itself. So we're looking at poll books, election night reporting, ballot delivery, voter registration databases, that kind of stuff. Right now in the US, we don't have any standards for which to measure those against. So we do a little bit for the election voting specific stuff, but for non-voting, not really. So what we're trying to put together is something that's a little bit lighter weight so that you can come through a verification process more often. But we're mixing 3 different things. And so this is one of the few programs I've ever worked on or seen that does something like this, where we've said it's not just a pen test code review or something of the finished product, but it is a combination of a process assessment, and this is where SAMM comes into play, an architecture review, and then security claims validation, which is essentially testing. So it's really the combination of the three that helps identify your risk profile. Like, how mature is your development process? How mature is your architecture for your software? And then how well did you actually implement based on that? And so for the process assessment part, we've taken SAMM and then we've added a little bit more to it. So a big factor within election technology is usability and accessibility. So we've actually created a sixth function and we added that in there. And then we also look at, so scores based on how well you did at different levels in your process assessment, how well you did for security and the design of your architecture. Those factor in for what kinds of tests we would run in the process when you make different kinds of changes. So it gives you kind of a maturity level related to different things like how you manage third party, how you do internal development, how you manage your environment. So depending on what kind of change you've made to the software, we're trying to streamline the testing process to essentially re-verify your software for whatever little bits of changes, minor, major, different kinds of changes, so that you don't have to go through this whole massive recertification process if you've made a few minor patches or small updates. So just to give you that kind of idea, but so in general, this is essentially the resource page. We have a SAMM user day, typically once a year. The last one is here. You can go find it on YouTube. If you want to learn more about SAMM, we have our own site. We also have a GitHub organization. The OWASP Slack, there is a Project SAMM channel that you can be part of. So if you've got questions or suggestions, by all means, please let us know. If you use SAMM and you want to be able to contribute, we can always use funding that helps pay for different types of activities, helps pay for graphics, publishing costs when we release different versions. And then the SAMM team typically gets together as much as we can, maybe once a year, to try and collaborate and make some good progress. Most of our work's done virtually, but periodically we try to get together in person. So that's what I had related to SAMM. I appreciate you all's time. I don't know, can we take questions or not sure at this point?
Hi, Brian. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
All right. Are we seeing any questions coming through on the chat? Do we have any questions from the folks in the room? And I promise not to preempt you, Brian. I'll pass it along.
No worries.
No questions? Really? Well, I'm hurt. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Brian. Thank you for joining us from the beautiful US of A. Is it Tennessee that you're in?
Yes, I'm in Tennessee. It's about 9:15 p.m. right now, so I'm getting the similar.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your telling us about SAMM. And your thank you gifts for your presentation will be in the mail soon. So you get to have a lovely black t-shirt and a couple of other gifts. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in Boston in a couple of months.
Sounds
Talking
good.
about that getting together once a year. We're trying to arrange a weekend meeting in Boston. So.
Yep.
All right.
Sounds good.
Let's all thank Brian.
Thank you all.